Hello, my name is Vanessa Sasson, and it is my pleasure to participate in this wonderful conversation that is spearheaded by Frances Garrett at the University of Toronto, and I thank her for including me in this conversation. I thought I would tell you a little bit of my story, and especially how I got myself to write a very particular book that I did not see coming in my trajectory, in the hopes that this will be helpful to those of you who are embarking upon this path to dream about other vocabularies. So let me tell you a little bit of the story and we'll see how it goes. I keep redoing this because it's actually really difficult to try to articulate kind of personal question about our relationship to the Academy. And so you may never see this because I may delete it and do it again, but maybe I'll stumble my way through it until I can get it right, because I really do have some things I'd like to share. So I did my PhD at a elite Canadian university, McGill University. I did it in comparative research. I was not encouraged to do comparative study, but I desperately wanted to do a comparative project. The powers that be at the time really wrung their hands and shook their heads and thought, we don't do comparative, we just do straightforward, because otherwise you'll be half a scholar and not a full scholar, is actually the language I was given. But I insisted, and one of my advisors was the dean at the time, and that helped. And so they agreed, but only if I did double the comps and double the languages and double the coursework, which I did. I worked really hard to do my PhD. I completed it. I understood the concerns that they had, because I can see how you do become half a scholar because you're spread very wide to do that kind of work. But it gave me a language and a capacity to always look beyond the instant of the field. And so I'm very glad I have that training, even though I understand some of the concerns that some of those professors at the time had. There's another element of how I was trained that's important. Not just that I was trained as a comparativist and that I was trained as a classical textual scholar, which is how most of us were trained 20 years ago, because that's what we thought was everything at the time. I was also kind of academically raised by this scholar, this professor, who was the dean and who was my advisor, who told me over and over again, he told all of us, not to forget how important teaching is, that the whole point of all of this education is to convey it, to share it with your students, and to love your family. He was a family man, and he talked about his children and his grandchildren all the time, and encouraged us to have a life beyond the Academy. And this really had a huge impact on, I think, all of us, that we were kind of academically raised by someone who told us, who was the dean, who had risen in his own ranks, but who told us, don't believe too hard in too much of it, and make sure you have a life. And make sure you love teaching, because this is actually what it's all about. And so he was the dean and still taught a full load as a professor, and had more graduate students than any of the other professors combined, I think, because he just loved what he did. And it was such a wonderful privilege to be raised in the system, is how I think of it, by someone who loved to teach and who didn't buy in too much into the stuff that really does not deserve to be bought into. And I think that had a huge effect in how I understood where I wanted to go. So I want to acknowledge that. I got a job very early on at Marianopolis College, where I teach. I'm a professor of religious studies there. It is a small college. It is not a university. It is a very spacious place intellectually, because research outputs don't matter there. The point there is to teach. And I have been teaching a 4-4 load right through my career without sabbaticals for more than 20 years. And I thank my advisor for my love of teaching that I got from him, that I hope I continue to give to my students. And so I've had a lot of joy in my field, joy in my work, but I also internalized a complaint. And I think this is where my complaint is is that I took in complaints. I don't know where I heard them, but they must have been everywhere. They are everywhere. But I internalized complaints inside myself that if I'm ever going to be enough, I have to be out there with the biggest publications and participating in the biggest conversations with the biggest names, because otherwise you're not a scholar. And so I took that into myself, even though it was not how my teacher taught me. And I forced myself to be part of this international community in ways that my employment did not require of me. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I published and I worked for years because I thought this is what a scholar is. Now, I'm very glad I did all of that. I had an extraordinary journey. I think that because my employment did not depend on it, I had a lot less pressure on my back. And so my story is really particular, and it is not relevant to everyone in that sense. And so I was able to write and produce and question without being terrified of a committee back home in my college reprimanding me or telling me it's not enough or that I didn't get to the right journal or the right publication. I just wrote. And in the process, with that freedom, I enjoyed it tremendously. And so even though I had this internalized complaint and this internalized fear that I had to keep going or I would never be enough in this, and I would never be counted as a member of the Academy, I had a great time. And I learned, and I had exciting conversations, and I met wonderful people. I met awful people as well. The Academy is full of all kinds of people. And I learned to steer clear of the ones I had no interest in, and to really make efforts to develop relationships with the ones that I learned to love. And over time collaborated with wonderful scholars and had an extraordinary journey, an intellectual journey of thinking and producing and wondering that was joyful, truly. Because the Academy really is about knowledge. And we get so caught up in all of the mess and all of the power plays and the ugliness and the elitism of this system. It is really easy to forget that this is about knowledge and about sharing knowledge and contributing so that we are better in the next generation. But that's often really hard to find. And so I had this very unusual opportunity to not be burdened by the demands of my institution. I had to teach 4-4. I didn't have any sabbaticals. So I had those burdens, but those were kind of labor burdens. I didn't have accusations. And so I was free to really be intellectually excited. And all the books that I produced in those first kind of 10, 15 years, and I produced a lot, I had fun doing it. And I learned a lot. And I was excited about the knowledge that I was participating in. And I'm so glad for that. And I met wonderful people. One of the most interesting things about this series, every talk that I've listened to so far, each speaker has mentioned how important friendship is. And I think that's so moving to hear all of these scholars participate in these talks say, don't forget, you need a network. And the friendships that I developed in the Academy have been some of the best friendships in my life. And so I'm very glad to have them. But despite all of that, I came to the end of one research project, a really big book that I produced, an edited volume called Little Buddhas, that turned into a kind of monster project. When I finished that book, I remember closing everything up and saying, gosh, that's done now. Now what? And I had this feeling that I'd been doing the same thing for close to 20 years at that point, that I had been writing in the same way, producing knowledge in the same way for almost 20 years. And this gnawing question arose, is there anything else? Or am I just going to keep writing the way I've been writing since I was a graduate student? And that was a kind of terrifying question to ask oneself, because you finally get good at it. You finally feel like you've got your place in it. And then a question comes and bothers you and says, okay, now you've settled in. Now what? You're going to just stay settled? Obviously not. And so I found myself really bugged by this question of whether there's more to do, or whether there's another way of engaging all this knowledge that I've had the privilege of accumulating for the last 20 years. And so that sat with me for a long time, and I wondered what else I could write or what else I could offer. And somebody one day said, well, if you could write anything in any way that you wanted, what would you write? And the answer came immediately. I would write the Buddha's wife's story. I would write the story of Yasodhara. But I would write it as a story. I want to write in her voice. And then immediately, no, but you can't do that. Because scholars don't write stories. Scholars write scholarship, and they produce in high-end journals, and they produce with academic publishers, and we don't write stories. We don't write novels. If you write a novel, you're not a scholar anymore. And so this is the question that began to plague me, is I knew in my heart of hearts I wanted to write differently, but I didn't know if I was allowed. And of course, I was technically allowed. You're allowed to do whatever you want. I was allowed in terms of my place of employment. I didn't have any pressure on my head to do something different. So I was absolutely allowed. And yet I had internalized a fear that to be a scholar, you have to function in a very particular way. And that knowledge has to be expressed using a very particular formula. And I was terrified that if I were to write a novel using my scholarship, that it was like I was giving up my place in the academy, a place that's not real, but a place that I had imagined I'd earned. But I couldn't stop myself from writing the book. Once I knew that I wanted to write it, there was no way to pull me back. Kind of like when I wanted to do my comparative PhD, I was just going to argue my way until I did what I wanted. And so one day I went to a coffee shop, I brought my laptop, I opened it up, and I said, let's just see what happens. And I began to write. And immediately I was having fun. And I thought, oh, this is great. Now it wasn't. It was terrible, and I deleted everything I wrote that day. But I remember coming home that day, and I told my husband, I just did the best writing of my life. And he laughed because he was like, uh-oh, what is she up to now? But it was just because I realized I was doing something new. I was doing something different. And so I wrote the book. It took me quite a few years. And the whole time I wrote the book, I was working through this fear that I was in the process also going to be divorcing myself from the academy, that I was changing course because a scholar doesn't write novels. And so I was going to write it. I was writing it. But I had convinced myself that as a result of that, I was giving up my place. A place, again, that, let me just say, is not real. But this is all the fabric of the imagination, right? And so I wrote the book. I completed it. I was filled with anguish the entire time, and you can ask my team of good friends in the academy who witnessed me throughout this process, struggling with these questions and supporting me through them. And then the book came out, and I awaited it. I awaited the dismissal. I awaited the higher-ups and the white men in bow ties at the big universities who would wag their fingers at me and say, well, nice book, off you go, you're not invited anymore. And it didn't happen. Now, obviously, most of you are probably thinking, obviously it wouldn't happen, but in my head, I had convinced myself that it would. And so I waited a while longer. And not only did that not happen, but something else began to happen. People took interest in the book. I joked for a while that I became kind of a place for people to come out of the closet to, because I was getting emails and messages from all kinds of scholars, from people in other fields, saying, I'm so excited you did that. I've wanted to do something like that, but never had the courage. Or I have half a novel in my desk, but I never finished it because I didn't think that's what I was supposed to do. I didn't imagine this kind of an outpouring. And yet all of a sudden, all of these scholars from all fields coming to secretly reveal to me that they had thought of doing something like that, but didn't know if they could. That was really unexpected. Over time, the book was reviewed, and it was welcomed in, surprisingly, the literary world and in the academic world. I did not see that coming. Nothing tremendous, I'm not J.K. Rowling, but enough to tell me, hey, you're onto something. Let's keep going. I also found myself in conversations with people, conversations I really did not anticipate, realizing that there was a conversation happening that I had not been paying attention to until then, that now I was being welcomed into. And it was the conversation of so many scholars, not just the ones who wanted to write a novel, but scholars who had been wondering for a long time or had been doing this, is transforming their scholarship into a new language to be able to share it with a wider audience. That I wasn't alone in my quest, even though I thought I was. And that there were all kinds of scholars out there who are already very practiced at it, or who were just beginning to think about it and were excited that I had done it. But that the question of what do we do with all of our knowledge is a question that I was not alone in asking. That I had spent all this time building up a career to then say, okay, what can I do with it? Not just build up my status, my personal status, but now can I transform it? Can I shape it into something else so that it can be a wider offering? And so many other people out there are having that same question and wondering what to do with it. And so now I've become part of a new conversation, new to me, but that has been floating around for a long time, a kind of engaged scholarship, a sense of responsibility, a collective responsibility that those of us who have had the privilege and the opportunity and the chance to participate in all of this education, that maybe we have a responsibility to take that education and do something new. Do something so that people who don't know how to read academic material without falling asleep can engage with it too. And so I realized there was a lot more here at stake, that I was becoming part of a wider conversation about the privilege of our education and that we need to use it. And there are so many of us doing it in so many different ways, from outing abuse and taking all of this knowledge to articulate where there's white privilege and pain, recognizing issues that demand attention from social justice, to sharing ideas in a popular format so that other people can think about them. But we can't talk to each other in silos forever. And I think that's what I was fighting, and that's what I finally come to realize I was undoing. What was even more exciting was the day a scholar who I admire very much pulled me aside one day and said, Vanessa, you've created a new academic genre, and you've got the field to yourself. I didn't expect that. But he said, you've created a new way of engaging with knowledge, a new way for students to think about ideas without it having to hammer it down their throats or bore them to death with our academic jargon. This is all extremely exciting, and I didn't see it coming. I had convinced myself, I had internalized the argument that a scholarship is a very conservative, that a scholar is a very conservative figure who plays by very specific rules and does not leave those rules, does not leave that game. No one had actually ever told that to me, but for some reason, I had come to believe it. And I was walking around with that narrative in my head and punishing myself for it. To then break out of that mold and to do something different, only to be met with all of this enthusiasm and excitement and curiosity. It changed everything for me. It's told me finally that to be a good scholar, you have to be all of yourself. You have to see the world actually through your own eyes. You have to say what you see. When I wrote this book, one of the kind of gnawing motivations was I had been reading hagiographies for 20 odd years, 25 years. Ashvaghosha is one of my favorites. Pali sources, the Jataka Nidana. I've been reading biographies of the Buddha forever. Ashvaghosha is so poetically beautiful. And I had this moment where I thought, I don't want to study him anymore. I want to be him. I want to see what it's like to give yourself over to those imaginations, to create a world, imagine them and write them and see what happens. I wanted to write a hagiography and not just describe them from the outside. But I had internalized the idea that a scholar is cold and calculating and just pays attention to the commas and the details and the multiple translations of every word. But I was wrong. There are so many ways to be a scholar. There are so many things to think. There are so many questions to ask, so many interpretations. And we cannot fix ourselves with just one or two. And so I know that my story is very particular. It is a story for later on, maybe in your trajectory, but maybe not. So many of the scholars who've been invited to participate in the series have offered you really important advice, the ones that I've been able to watch so far. I'm sorry, there's a garbage truck right outside. I hope it's not too distracting and I'm only one hearing it. But the people who've participated in this have given you really good advice about how to navigate the system as you're starting out, how to identify issues and work through them or bypass them. Take that advice and listen to them. What I have to offer is a little bit different. It's hopefully to give you an imagination that once you have navigated, once you've found a little bit of your footing, and you have to be smart about it, and you have to work hard, but once you've found some of that footing, and you found your network and the people who will support you, which you need, let yourself really figure out what you see and try to articulate it. The whole point of scholarship is that we build on each other. We cannot simply keep reproducing the scholarship of the 19th century. We cannot close ourselves in to one particular form and one particular way of reading the tradition, because then we don't grow, we don't evolve, we're not stimulated anymore. We are not participating in real education. To be educated is to go beyond. It is to step outside of what we know and to know more. And to do that, we have to see things differently. We have to ask new questions. We have to wonder. We have to try being Ashvaghosha and not just read Ashvaghosha and study his language. We have to study his language. We have to translate him. We have to think about him. We have to put him in context. But we also have to ask new questions. What was it like to imagine the story for himself? Let me try it and see what happens. So I hope that with this talk, I've given you an opportunity to ask yourself the question of, what will you do? This is a little bit of what I've done, and I'm so glad I did it. And I hope that this isn't the end of my journey and that I have more questions to ask in the future. And we'll do some kind of bizarre thing again where I change my own conversation. I'm excited for all of you. I'm excited for the next generation. I look forward to finding out what new questions you will ask and watching as you try to answer them. May you be well. May you have good careers exactly as you want them to be.